All right. Good evening, everybody. So, 2 weeks ago, most of what we did was history, sort of the history of Zionism in America and the development of the American Jewish community's relationship with Zionism and with Israel. And I wanted to start. I wanted to start tonight by sort of explaining why I did what I did, because after services, I think it was the subsequent Shabbat, Alan mentioned, and a few of us were schmoozing, that I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that you thought that the class was good, but that was mostly history, and so it raised the whole question of, like, why do we even study history? And it occurred to me, really, in thinking about that the whole existence of the type of Judaism that we practice is based on the study of history. Okay, when I don't want to get too much into the woods here, right? But when Reform Judaism first started, okay, and this is a little bit touchy because conservative Judaism is actually historically a split off from Reform, right? There was simply Judaism, and then Reform Judaism started, and then Orthodoxy was a reaction to Reform, and then conservative felt that Reform had gone too far, so they split off from Reform, okay? But it was rooted in what was known in Germany as Wissenschaft des Judentums, means the scientific study of Judaism, and especially of Jewish history. Okay, and the whole idea was that when the Orthodox attacked progressive Jews for making changes in Judaism, right, because the myth is that Judaism never changes and has never changed, it sort of dropped intact from the heavens. And by the study of history, they could demonstrate that, in fact, there had been changes. And if there had been changes, then there could be changes. Now, that doesn't necessarily justify any particular change, right? But it does justify the idea that change is possible and permissible. Okay, so, people have a tendency to make these blanket categorical statements like Zionism is an intrinsic part of Judaism, or it's essential to Jewish identity. There's no Jewish identity without Israel, or whatever kind of categorical statement that you want to make. And in my opinion, as a student of history, I'm going to say categorically that any categorical statement you make is false. There is no such thing. But, in particular, as we saw 2 weeks ago, if we look at the history of the American Jewish community, the majority of the American Jewish community was at best lukewarm to Zionism until the rise of Hitler. And Israel did not play the central role that it currently plays in American Jewish life until 1967. All right, so what was essential and intrinsic has changed, and it could change again. Again, that doesn't justify any particular change, but it does help us to understand that things have changed, and that if things have changed, the idea of change is not out of bounds. And to say that, identification with Israel has always been an important part of American Jewish identity is just historically not so. All right, most American Jews, as I said, were not favorable to Zionism until the mid to late 30s. And even then, the whole question of support of a Jewish state as opposed to a Jewish homeland is still very, very controversial. Okay, so any questions or comments on that before I move on? Okay, great. So, 2 weeks ago, towards the end, I made the statement, which Sue strongly endorsed, that to be pro-Israel does not necessarily mean that you have to be pro any particular government of Israel, right? And we don't have a lot of good data on attitudes towards Israel in the American Jewish community. I will say, in general, reliable data on Jewish attitudes is very, very hard to come by, right? I mean, for all kinds of reasons, because first of all, I mean, you can know, for example, how many African Americans there are in the US population because the government asked that question. We don't know how many Jews because the government doesn't ask that question and is not allowed to ask that question, right? So we don't even know where to begin. And then so it has to be by random digit dialing, which is harder and harder. I mean, I'm going to gather that I am not the only person here who does not answer the phone if you don't recognize the number, right? So random digit dial, and then, are any Jews here? Why do they want to know if I'm Jewish, right? Are they making a list so they can come and get me? I better say no, right? So it's really, really hard to get good data on Jewish attitudes. So the best current data that we have is actually from 2013, the 2013 Pew Foundation Portrait of American Jews. Although they're actually, the Cohen Center at Brandeis is working on a new report which should be released fairly soon. Some of it has already been, and what you may have seen in the news recently, a report that according to the latest study, there are 7.2 million Jews in the United States, which is more than most people thought. And that's from the new Cohen Center study, but we don't have a lot yet beyond that. So, but we have the 2013 Pew study, which is considered to be pretty reliable.
Rabbi, you say who's a Jew, and of course that brings up the question: how do they determine that? Do you self-identify as a Jew? Is that what that is?
It is self-identification, but then they try and narrow that down. I mean, you'll see, for example, in the Pew survey, all of these, I didn't copy this down because it wasn't relevant necessarily to the particular questions, but Jews by religion and then Jews of no religion, right? So that people will say, I'm a Jew and my religion is Judaism. And then people will say, I'm a Jew, but I don't have any religion. Okay, what they don't have in Pew is people who say Jew of another religion, right? And so, that's another whole, can of worms that we don't, but I mean, so it's by self-identification. Now, having said that, I really don't know if there are circumstances, and if so, what those circumstances would be, where they would throw out your answers, or where they would say, you self-identify as a Jew, but ain't nobody else thinks you're a Jew, so we're not throwing your data into the hopper. But so here's just some data about attitudes towards Israel. Okay, do you feel very attached or somewhat attached or not at all attached? Okay, so in the 18 to 25 group, 25% feel very attached and 35% feel somewhat attached to Israel, right? So we have 60% of the 18 to 29 group who feel at least some attachment to Israel. Okay, but contrast this. I took down data only from the 18 to 29 and the 65 plus. Okay, so in the 65 plus group, 38% feel very attached and 41 somewhat attached, right? So you have a difference of, 60% feeling some degree of attachment in the youngest group to 71% feeling some degree of attachment in the oldest group. Okay, now, question, is caring about Israel an essential part of being Jewish, right? Is caring about Israel an essential part of being Jewish? And the possible answers are yes, it's essential. No, it's important but not essential, or it's not important. Okay, in the 18 to 29 group, 32% said it's essential, 49% said it's important but not essential, and 19% not important. Okay, in the 65 group, 53% say it's essential, 39% important but not essential, and 7% not important, right? So I mean, and that's the biggest, though, I think, that 19% of the 18 to 29 group say it's not important, whereas only 7% in the 65 plus group. Okay, so there's a huge gap. I mean, again, the good news from the perspective of Israel is that even in the youngest generation, there's still a lot of identification with Israel. The idea that caring about Israel is important to Jewish identity, so on and so forth, right? I mean, it's still, pretty strong numbers, but the trends are definitely, downward as you go, from the oldest group to the youngest group. And this is 2013. And I have to speculate that 8 years later, the trends are continuing. I mean, I would speculate that, frankly, in every age group, feeling very connected to Israel has declined. Feeling that caring about Israel is very important has declined for reasons, some of which we discussed in the last class, right? I mean, the fact that there was, for the last 4 years, this pretty open alliance between Trump and Netanyahu and the evangelicals, and that most American Jews are Democrats. And again, that's just a statement of fact. That's not a normative or a value judgment. It's just a statement of fact. Okay, so is a two-state solution possible? Okay, now again, the question is it possible, right? Not is it desired, is it a good thing, right? But I would suspect that people who say yes, it's possible would tend to be the people who support it, right? Because a lot of the people who oppose it say, oh, it'll never work, and that's why I'm opposed to it. But so is a two-state solution possible? In the youngest group, 70% say yes, 29% say no. In the oldest group, 55% say yes, 35% say no. Okay. Now, here's a really interesting question. All right. Is the Israeli government making a sincere effort to reach a peaceful settlement of the conflict, right? Is the Israeli government making a sincere effort for a peaceful settlement of the conflict? In the 18 to 29% group, only 26% said yes. In the 65 plus group, 45% said yes. So again, but all of these numbers are interesting because even in the oldest group, which is most supportive of Israel and most connected to Israel, only 45% feel that the Israeli government was making a sincere effort to reach a peaceful resolution of the conflict, right? So I think in general, in 2013, there was a kind of jaundiced or dubious view of how serious the Israeli government actually was about trying to reach peace. Okay, and then here's the last question that I'm gonna bring, the last data, right? Does the building of settlements hurt? I'm sorry, does the building of settlements help, hurt, or make no difference? Okay, help, hurt, or make no difference. The 18 to 29 group, 11% say it helps, 50% say it hurts, 28% say it makes no difference. Okay, in the 65 plus group, 20% say it helps, 43% say it hurts, 26% say no difference. Okay, so again, I mean, what's interesting is that even, so you have a majority of the 18 to 29 group who say the settlements hurt the cause of peace. But even in the 65% group, you have a 43% who say that they hurt the cause of peace. So, I think from my perspective, a fairly balanced view, across the board. But again, clearly less support for Israel as you go down in age. And I would be extremely surprised if the Cohen Center data does not show that trend has continued. Okay, so questions or comments on this so far?
Just most of the people who were asked never met a settler, probably. Just like surveys are, I can say my opinion about Taiwan, but I've never been there. I never even heard a piece of news about Taiwan.
Right. Well, Barnaby can tell you about Taiwan afterwards. But that
was just an example.
You're absolutely right. I mean, but this is a survey of attitudes, right? It's a survey of attitudes. And look, there's no question. I mean, in terms of settlers, I mean, as they say in Hebrew, yesh v'yesh, right? I mean, there's all different kinds. I mean, I have a very good friend who lives in Tekoa. He's a like they call Hardal, right? Haredi with a long beard and a big kippah, who's very active in peace movements, right? Hanan Schlesinger, I don't know if you know him, but and there was Rabbi Menachem Froman, Zichrono Levrcha. So there's all kinds of, but we're talking about attitudes, right? And attitudes don't necessarily have to be based in fact, right? But people act on their perceptions, whether those perceptions are fair or accurate or whatever. Okay. Any other questions or comments? All right, so we'll go on. So this morning, and I know not everybody saw, because not everybody is necessarily on the list for this class, but I sent out an article from the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, from JTA, over a discussion that took place recently at the University of Iowa about creating a designated Jewish seat as a representative of the Jewish community and Jewish concerns in the student government at the University of Iowa. And I thought it was a really interesting article, but the editor of, it was a different journalist, but a friend of mine said, one of the things that was interesting to him about this article also was it showed how much can be accomplished when you let the students settle it and outside organizations don't butt in. Okay, and I can tell you that is definitely true. I mean, I started my career as a Hillel director, right? And this coincided with a period when Farrakhan was going from campus to campus, right? And there was a lot of tension on a lot of campuses between Jews and African Americans. And generally, I will tell, in my opinion, and the opinion of most Hillel professionals at the time, when outside organizations like the Anti-Defamation League or the American Jewish Committee or the American Jewish Congress or the JCRC got involved, it generally exacerbated the situation and made it worse. Because they would parachute in, tell us what to do, fundraise over it, and then leave, and then we had to deal with the fallout, right? And I also said in a kind of sarcastic but not totally way that bringing Farrakhan to campus was an excellent Hillel program, because Farrakhan would come give a speech and Hillel would be packed on the next Shabbat, right? So it wasn't necessarily, you know, such a terrible thing. But so there was a proposal at the University of Iowa. Apparently, in the University of Iowa, in the Student Senate, they have certain constituency seats that are reserved for a member of that constituency and chosen by that constituency. So that, you know, aside from the fact, I mean, there could be a Black student who runs for Student Senate from their dorm or their class or whatever, but there's also a designated Black seat chosen by the Black Student Union. There's a designated LGBT seat chosen by the LGBT Student Union. And there was a proposal to create a designated Jewish seat chosen by Hillel. And at first, it didn't pass. And the people who spoke against it said, well, you know, Hillel's pro-Israel, and student government shouldn't be about politics. It should be about, you know, student issues and student concerns. And why should we be giving a seat to an organization that supports one side of the conflict? And it was, you know, but it kicked off some really good debate and some really good discussion. And in the end, after, you know, a few weeks or months of debate and discussion, the student government voted almost unanimously to create this Jewish constituency seat. You know, I thought it was an interesting article. And you know, I will tell you that, again, having started my career as a Hillel rabbi, I mean, and my first job was at the University of Virginia, okay, which, again, there's a definite difference between working at a public university versus working at a private university, right? Because at a private university, the administration is going to be much more hands-off, much more keeping you at arm's length. I mean, especially at the University of Virginia, which was founded by Thomas Jefferson, right? The father of religious freedom in our country, right? I mean, the person who literally created the phrase wall of separation, right? So, you know, and then after that, I was at American University, which is nominally United Methodist, where the campus ministry people, you know, are much more integrated into the whole framework of the university, right? But when I got to UVA, you know, they related to me as a campus minister, like all the other campus ministers, right? But I was able to eventually convince the student affairs folks that, yes, as the rabbi, I am analogous to the Methodist minister who runs the Wesley Foundation or the priest who runs the Newman Foundation, but I'm also analogous to the director of the Black Student Union in a way, because there is this ethnic component to, I mean, even the word, do we say Judaism or Jewishness, right? And it becomes complicated, right? And in Hebrew, even more so, because the word is Yahadut, right? And there's no real, which means Judaism. There's no real word for Jewishness. A professor of mine coined the word Yehudiut, but I think it never really caught on, right? But there's this ethnic, I mean, if somebody said to you, I'm an atheist Methodist, right? That makes no sense whatsoever, right? But if somebody says, I'm an atheist Jew, right, well, I mean, I might not be happy about it, but you know, it would never in a million years cross my mind to say this, oh, if you're an atheist, you're not a Jew, right? If you're an atheist, you can't join our shul, right? I mean, who cares, right? Join. You can, right? So there is this ethnic and cultural aspect to Jewishness that does not exist with other American religions, right? And the problem from my perspective is that Western society has certain slots, right? I mean, and I remember going back even to high school, right, where I would explain, and I certainly was not really sophisticated about this, right, but I went to a public high school that was about 80% Catholic, okay, and almost all of my classmates were Irish, Polish, or Italian Catholics, and I would say to my class, yes, I am Jewish in the way that you are Catholic, but I'm also Jewish in the way that you are Italian, right? And that makes sense, you know, to all of us, right? But on the other hand, I mean, can you switch your ethnicity? And the answer is yes, you can, right? I mean, anybody who converts to Judaism understands that there's this ethnic component as well, right? And if you, as my wife did, if you grow up Baptist in Kentucky and now you're Jewish, right? None of the foods that you ate as a kid can you eat now, with the possible exception of grits and cornbread, right? 90% of what she grew up on is off the table. I mean, off the table, literally and metaphorically, right? So you know, you know, are we a religion? Are we an ethnicity? Are we a nation? You know, and the answer is yes. We're all of those, right? But that is hard because society, and it's not just the United States. I mean, I think it's Western society as a whole wants to pigeonhole you, and we are essentially non-Western in that sense. And so, you know, it becomes hard to really pigeonhole us. I mean, especially since, you know, I just said, right, that because there's this ethnic element, right, the idea of a Jewish atheist makes perfect sense, right? For that matter, Jubus, right? Jewish Buddhists, right? There are Jewish Buddhists, and very, very few people say, oh, well, if you're a Buddhist, then you're no longer a Jew, right? But go call yourself a Jewish Catholic, right? Go call yourself a Jewish evangelical. You're no longer a Jew, right? You have forfeited your, and I think it's true. Sociologically, it is definitely true, right? You can keep your Jew card if you become a Buddhist or, you know, a practitioner of transcendental meditation or whatever. But if you become a Catholic or evangelical, you have forfeited your Jew card, sociologically, not halakhically, but sociologically. Yeah, Leah.
So I think too that you, in a lot of senses in American culture, you forfeit your liberal card if you're pro-Israel. At least that's what it feels like in my circles, that I can be pro Black Lives Matter and gay and lesbian rights, but I start talking about pro-Israel and I don't quite fit into that hole. And in terms of what Mr. Goldman said, I think it's really important in terms of individuals' connection to Israel, in terms of how they view it. It's not just Americans sitting on the sidelines saying, well, I pick this one. It's what is my connection to the country? And just very briefly, my connection, both in living there when I was a kid and in going back when I was an adult, I was in this area for new immigrants. And we were plopped off there as American volunteers. And it was Friday night. And so we couldn't figure out the stove in our little hut. And so we went to our neighbors who were Ethiopian, and they said, stove on Friday night. I thought you were Jewish. Oh, you're American. Okay, you'll have dinner with us. And so they told us the story of how they walked from Ethiopia through the Sudan only at night. And here they were eating dinner with me, the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. And to me, that was Israel. But I think so many Americans don't have such a personal experience with Israel and are just sort of, saying which way the political way swings them.
Right. No, look, I think that there is some truth to that. I mean, I raised the question 2 weeks ago, how many American Jews have a favorite Israeli poet, right? Or how many American Jews have a favorite Israeli musician, right? And that kind of like intimate connection to Israeli culture. I also think that, paradoxically, right? I mean, virtually all of my closest friends have spent at least a year in Israel, right? If not longer. I mean, I myself spent 4 years in Israel. It creates a much more nuanced view of Israel, right? That this idea of critical support, right? And this is where it does become complicated because it also is, I mean, a lot of it is emotional in ways that are beyond rational, right? I mean, if I, tell my brother, you're a jerk, stop being a jerk, that's fine, right? If you come to me and say, your brother's a real jerk, right? I'm going to get my back up, right? I mean, even if I've said the same thing 5 minutes earlier, right? Because there's a reflexive instinct to defend your family, right? Even if you think they're behaving in ways that are wrong or destructive, right? And that becomes problematic, right? It becomes problematic, and I would love to see, a situation where people really could have, where American Jews really could have a favorite Israeli poet or favorite Israeli musician, right? Or argue with me, the relative merits of, I don't know, Arik Einstein versus Yehuda Poliker, without being bogged down in the politics of it, right? I mean, but it's really, it's hard to do, I think, right? So, all right. And anybody else want to chime in? Because this is precisely the kind of conversation that I want.
Rabbi Arian, yes, yeah. I have a additional issue. One of the biggest struggles that I personally face, and I know the Jewish community faces, is being able to accept Jews of any ethnic background. As there's a growing presence of Black Jews in our country. And in addition, unfortunately, Asian people have been so hurt by incidents, one can say like anti-Semitism, and there are Jewish Asians. And it seems to me, in talking about tolerance, acceptance, understanding, and living as a community, I feel that groups like that may not only have different perspectives of Israel, but unfortunately, we as a mainline group of Jews have our own reservations and reluctance to really build community with them.
I think that there is some truth to that. I mean, I would hope, I believe that the American Jewish community is changing, that there is a greater awareness that not all American Jews are white-skinned descendants of Eastern European immigrants. That, I will tell you that in this sense, Israel, I mean, I have had this opportunity many times with people who were converts, and whether they were converts of color or blue-eyed blonde converts who are constantly told, "Oh, you don't look Jewish," right? And they go to Israel, and they because the Israeli Jewish community is so much more diverse than the American Jewish community, that they feel, oh, it's okay that I don't look like a Jew in the stereotypical sense, because Israel is filled with people who look, all kinds of ways, right? Although I have to tell you, I mean, I had a funny discussion with my dad. I mean, God bless him, 92 years old, may he live to 120, but, grew up in New York, children of Yiddish speaking immigrants. And when I was living in Israel, and he came to visit me, and we went to a soccer game in Jerusalem. Okay. Now there are two main soccer teams in Jerusalem, and only in Israel, right? It's politics, right? If you're right wing, you root for Beitar, and if you're left wing, you root for Hapoel, right? And we went to a Beitar game, and my dad is looking around, and he's saying, "Why are there so many Arabs here?" And I said, "Dad, I guarantee you that there are no Arabs here, right? These are Israeli Jews of Moroccan, Iraqi, maybe Iranian descent." And then he says, "How did they get so dark?" And I said, "Wrong question, Dad. How did we get so light?" Right? Because if we are really indigenous to the Middle East, why do we look like white Europeans? Those of us who do look like white Europeans, right? So, but, to my dad, really a Jew, a religious Jew speaks Yiddish, and he was constantly baffled speaking to, clearly observant Israelis who don't speak Yiddish, right? Because they're from from the Eastern communities. And he never spent enough time in Israel to really catch on. Okay. So anybody else, or shall we move on? All right. So it seems to me, okay, and here I'm speaking entirely for myself. I am not speaking for the American Jewish community or Kehillat Shalom or the conservative movement or anybody other than myself, right? It seems to me, right, so we have, I think, established that Jewishness has an ethnic component. And if that is the case, then affinity for Israel is natural, as it is the largest Jewish community, and it's a key producer of Jewish culture. I mean, like for example, and one of these days I should really teach a mini course on the poetry of Yehuda Amichai, right? Because there is no, and Amichai, I mean, if you asked Amichai, Ha'imata dati, he would say, ani chiloni, right? Are you religious? No, I'm secular. But he grew up, you know, in an Orthodox community, and much of his poetry is about his struggle with God, especially after the Holocaust, right? And there is, you know, there are few examples, I think, of Jewish cultural, religious creativity more profound than the poetry of Yehuda Amichai, who I once had the privilege of meeting, actually. I have a great story about that if we have time. But you know, so this idea of Israel as a key producer of Jewish culture, right, which was the vision of Ahad Ha'am, right, that one of the early thinkers of the Zionist movement, who, unlike Herzl, you know, Herzl thought that once Israel was established, all the Jews in the world would live in Israel. And if you were a Jew in the diaspora, you would face one of two choices. Either you would move to Israel or you would assimilate, but the diaspora would self-liquidate. But Ahad Ha'am said no, but Israel would be the spiritual center, right? Like Ki Mitzion Tetzei Torah, for out of Zion shall go forth Torah. But Ahad Ha'am's view of Torah was much more cultural and artistic and holistic, and not specifically religious, but that Israel would be the cultural center, nourishing world Jewry, right? So if there is an ethnic component to Jewishness, and we are an ethnos, and in principle, we have the same right to self-determination as any other ethnos, right? Now, having said that, there are ethnoses, I don't know what the plural is, my Greek is not that good, who I would say have a right to self-determination, but have not been able to exercise it. I mean, the Kurds come to mind, for example. I mean, we have a right, I think we have a right to self-determination, just like the Kurds do. The Kurds have not been able to put that into practice. We, fortunately, have. Okay, but, you know, our right to self-determination, now here's where you have a problem, okay, that within the territory of the state of Israel, like within the Green Line, right, you have 25% almost of the 9 million citizens who are of a different ethnos, right? And we see right now, how Israel is struggling with this question, right? I mean, nobody's going to be able to put together a government, right? Nobody's going to be able to put together a government, right? And one of the key reasons that nobody is going to be able to put together a government is because large enough blocs on both the left and the right of the spectrum have said, we will not be part of a government that depends on votes of Arab parties to exist, right? And from my perspective, I have to say, from my perspective, this is a problem, because Israel, on the one hand, is the Jewish state, or the state of the Jews. Medinat HaYehudim really doesn't mean the Jewish state, it means the state of the Jews, right? But on the other hand, it's a state of all its citizens, right? And the minute you say that the vote of 20% of the citizens is puzzle, it doesn't count, where does that leave us, right? I mean, we all want Israel to be Jewish and democratic, and nobody has successfully figured out how to put that into effect, right? And that's just within the state of Israel. And then in addition, you have 5 million people in the you want to call it the West Bank, you want to call it Judea and Samaria, whatever you want to call it, who have no citizenship and no voice, right? So again, we want Israel to be a Jewish. I remember asking in shul once, okay, who here thinks Israel should be a Jewish and democratic state? Everybody raised their hands, right? Who knows how to achieve that? Nobody raised their hand, right? It's tough. It is tough, right? But that is a problem. Okay, so I want to stop there. Again, I really don't want to argue the politics of it. But again, if there are questions or comments, please go ahead. Yeah, Barnaby.
I mean, this is, the paradox between two ideologies that are, in many ways, diametrically opposed as to, be mutually exclusive. But on the other hand, people have found ways to work, within each other's, mindsets to produce some sort of compromise. And those ideologies are nationalism and liberal democracy. Liberal democracy, like both are products of Europe, but of different times. Liberal democracy was more of the early 19th century, late 18th century, and it was generally involved, I wouldn't say mono-ethnic states, but they did heavily involve settler colonial programs. And so, how could the American continent give birth to the most famous liberal democracy in the world? Is because it was, from the outset, a nation of immigrants.
Right.
Even though that could be a title in dispute. But on the other hand, nationalism was, it had roots in the Greek Revolution, but really it came into vogue around, the Kaiser, not the Kaiser, well, Bismarck's time.
Right.
And it was about having ethnic cohesion, like creating a nation. And Zionism is very much, at least as envisioned by its founders, it was very much a part of the latter. And yet, under, considering it was also a post-war creation, the state of Israel also tries its best to emulate the liberal democratic, models of, well, the West that helped create it. And so these two ideologies come, at many times at odds with each other, with so the so-called Arab question, the Jewish character. Again, not for us to work out.
No, and you're absolutely right. And look, I mean, if you look at the history of Zionism, I think it quite explicitly Titus. I mean, one of the first works of what we call modern Zionism was Moses Hess' Rome and Jerusalem, right? He wasn't talking about Rome in the sense of the Roman Empire. He was talking about the unification of Italy as a model for the creation of the state of the Jews. So there's no question that idea of kind of liberal ethno-nationalism, right? Zionism was clearly a part of that. All right, so I wanted to move on to a discussion of what's known as BDS, right? Boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Okay, and now so I want to throw out a question. Okay, so Georgia recently passed a number of laws that are perceived to restrict voting rights, right? That will have the effect and quite possibly the intent of reducing the number of non-white Georgians who vote in elections, right? And as a result, there has been a call for an economic boycott of the state of Georgia, right? Major League Baseball has pulled the All-Star game out of Georgia. There's people calling for boycotts of Coca-Cola, of Delta Airlines, although Coca-Cola and Delta Airlines have tried really to get in front of that by issuing statements against these laws and so on and so forth. So let me ask this question. Was the decision of Major League Baseball to move the All-Star game out of Georgia, was that immoral? Why not? Alan and then Leon.
First off, I'm really glad Leon is here. So I'm always happy to have you in class, Leon. So thank you. But secondly, I take a much more cynical view than that. Maybe there are people that believe that this is, you should do this for moral reasons. But what's bothered me, and I was going to say before, Israel, the strength of Israel, ultimately, the strength of any country, in my opinion, ultimately, only because I've been a lawyer for over 40 years, is how fair your legal system is. And if these voting rights really are impacted, and I think they are, and certainly the perception is that they are, I think a couple of things. I think number one, Coca-Cola and Delta and everyone else, and certainly there are good people there, but they see this as the damage that a boycott is going to do to them. I'm not saying it's good or bad, it's just self-interest.
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing is that I really believe that by creating this attempt to block people, Stacey Abrams and people like that are going to be empowered and are going to form groups that are going to change the dynamic in Georgia and in other places, and they're going to exercise their voting rights, because even though it's certainly not in accordance with what everybody wants, our Supreme Court, our court system has held up throughout the issues that we had during the last 4 years, throughout our history. And I think that is where, if something is an egregious of voting issue, that's where it's going to go. But I think in the meantime, public pressure is going to put the pressure on Coca-Cola and people like that.
Leon.
That's okay. What he said.
Okay. So some of you may gather where I'm going with this, right? I mean, when I say the organized Jewish community, I mean like the Jewish Community Relations Councils and the American Jewish Committee and the Anti-Defamation League have been pushing throughout the country laws against boycott, divestment, and sanctions, right? Boycott and divestment and sanctions is a Palestinian move to essentially cut off all ties with Israel. Here in Maryland, Governor Hogan issued an executive order against BDS. There's this fellow, Saqib Ali, who's running for the legislature in the 15th district, who is a civil engineer, suing the state because he won't sign the anti-BDS statement, which makes him illegal to bid for job contracts with the state, and so on and so forth. Now here's where I stand on this issue. I have absolutely no use or sympathy for BDS, and I have absolutely no use or sympathy for anti-BDS laws. I think that we have historically believed in the First Amendment, and if ideas are bad, they will lose in the marketplace of ideas. I have, by the way, no problem whatsoever with a resolution of a legislature saying it is the sense of the legislature that BDS is wrong or bad, or the governor issuing a statement, it is my belief that BDS is wrong and bad. But I don't think that we get very far by making things that are wrong and bad illegal. I think it's, I mean, the only difference that I can see between supporting boycott of Georgia and opposing BDS is that I agree with one and disagree with another, right? But agreeing with one and disagreeing with another is not a basis for legislation, right? It's a basis for your own personal action, right? It's a basis for your own personal action, right? So now I oppose BDS, okay, because I think it is too, for a couple of reasons. One is that it's not clear what its goals are, okay? And on by this, I mean, and this is a problem from my perspective as a liberal Zionist or progressive Zionist, a problem with the whole Palestinian movement. In other words, what are your goals, right? In other words, and I'm being a little short here, is the problem 1967 or is the problem 1948, right? In other words, do you want Israel out of the occupied territories, or do you want Israel to not exist at all, right? And when you use the term occupied territories, do you mean, you know, the West Bank and Gaza, or do you mean, you know, Tel Aviv and Netanya and Nahariya, right? And for a lot of Palestinians and for a lot of BDS supporters, they mean Tel Aviv and Netanya and Nahariya, right? So that is my first problem with it. My second problem with it is that it wants to cut off relations with Israel in its entirety, even academic exchanges, right? Preventing students from spending their junior year at the Hebrew University or Tel Aviv University, preventing Israeli academics from coming as guest professors in America, which, I mean, if there's going to be change in Israel, it's going to come from academics and artists, right? And to boycott all Israeli academics and artists, I think is illiberal, right? It is the pursuit of freedom by illiberal means, right? So, you know, but on the other hand, I really think that Israel does not do itself a favor by fighting, like, for example, in a lot of, particularly in the EU, there have been laws to label produce from settlements as produce from settlements. And, you know, Israel and Jewish communities have fought that, right? And again, I'm not, you can want to or not want to, I'm not talking about the right or wrong, right? But by saying that there's no difference between Israel and the territories, right? It, in my opinion, strengthens the move to BDS, right? Because I will tell you, I mean, I go out of my way to buy Israeli products, right? If I am shopping and there are two brands of chocolate and one is from Israel and one is not from Israel, and these, you know, I would say the Israeli product has to be twice as expensive and half as good for me to not buy it. Right, I will always buy Israeli products in preference to non-Israeli products, right? And I go out of my way to support the Israeli economy. But, you know, if I knew that a product came from certain settlements, I'm not saying, well, I would probably not buy it. I mean, I don't formally boycott settlement products, but I have no problem with it. I certainly don't go out of my way to buy them either, right? So, you know, I think that you know, to the extent that Israel refuses to acknowledge a difference between Israel and the territories, it undermines that argument against against the boycott. I think. I mean, speaking just very personally. But the question is BDS anti-Semitic? I think it can be. I mean, if I encounter somebody, particularly who's not a Palestinian, right? A non-Palestinian, non-Jew whose whole focus is on how terrible Israel is, I question that person, right? I really do. I mean, I mentioned Saqib Ali. Now, I don't live in his district, right? And Shannon, somehow I got on his email list. I don't know how, and I stay on it. I probably agree with him on 95% of all issues facing the state, right? I would never in a million years vote for him, right? Because of his focus on in my opinion, his obsessive focus on Israel, which is disproportionate. He is Muslim, but he's not Palestinian. And again, I'm just speaking very, very personally. So I think that I see your hand. I'll get to you in a second, Barnaby. I think that this obsession with Israel can be anti-Semitic. I mean, there are certainly other countries in the world that are far worse offenders of human rights. I mean, and how many people are talking about let's boycott China because of the Uyghurs, right? Let's boycott Myanmar because of the Rohingya, right? I mean, but at the same time, again, that shows me why BDS is wrong. It doesn't show me why it should be illegal, right? I mean, if we had a law against hypocrisy, 90% of the country would be in jail at some point, right? I mean, Barnaby, go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to do a full disclosure and announce myself as a Min. Saqib Ali, Min meaning heretic. Saqib Ali is actually on friendly terms with me.
Okay.
And trust me, Israel is far from his pet cause. It might seem that way because we're Jewish,
right?
But I actually I'm actually in contact with him on Facebook, and I can tell you that the situation in China with the Uyghurs is one of his top priorities right now.
Okay, good.
And on that note, in line with my heresy, I wouldn't say outright that I support BDS on Israel per se, but I look at their tactics and their fallings.
Grandma?
And not only me, a number of other activists on Chinese human rights have adopted the same language of BDS on China. As a matter of fact, these past 2 weeks, there was a major movement in the garment industry to essentially boycott Xinjiang cotton. Xinjiang meaning the Chinese name for East Turkestan,
Right.
The Uyghur homeland, and because there was a concern that forced labor might have been used or was definitely used on it, and this induced a severe backlash from not only the Chinese government but also Chinese nationalists in manners that echo the reaction to BDS so much.
Right.
Those of us who support the Xinjiang boycott are xenophobes. We are unfairly singling out China. All the arguments that Jewish people and Israelis put out for BDS on Israel, the Chinese government and Chinese people, some Chinese people, there are a lot of them, have been pushing towards, H&M, well, whoever's not H&M and Nike and all these other, international corporations who say, no, we're actually going to do a boycott. And, speaking of sanctions, the U.S. government has effectively, or I would say ineffectively, announced sanctions on certain Chinese politicians that have been accused of involving atrocities in East Turkestan. And, lahavdil el fadalos. Israel is what I call a dysfunctional democracy. China is a very functional tyranny. Those are two different meaning, in the other sense of the word, two different categories. But seeing the nationalist element play out, I can see so many parallels. I can't help but sympathize in some twisted way with BDS on Israel.
My perspective is, look, I mean, I would argue with you. I mean, I would argue with you, but I would not want to write you out of the community because of my argument with you, right? And this is, I think, the problem is that the Jewish defense organizations, right, want us to circle the wagon so much that it's not enough for me to simply say to you, Barnaby, I disagree with you, but Barnaby, you have placed yourself outside the community, right? And in which case, we'd probably say that to 25, 30% of Jews who are under 30, right? And it's only getting worse. I mean, I remember I found notes to a talk I gave 3 years ago, right? That if ultimately Israel says to American Jews, choose Israel or choose your liberal values, I don't think Israel wins that contest, frankly. And this is frankly what scares me. In other words, I am concerned about Israel's current path, not merely for theoretical reasons, but because I think it's dangerous to Israel. And it's certainly dangerous to the relationship between Israel and world Jewry. So I have a lot of sympathy for what you're saying too. And in terms of Sakiv, I mean, we can talk more. He might want to pay attention to the way he is perceived by someone like me, right? If he hopes to actually win an election and not just be a gadfly. Anybody else? All right. Good night, everybody. Lila Tov, thank you once again for a really interesting discussion.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
just a complete side note, but Arlene and I are going to go up and visit our grandchildren over the weekend. So I'm not going to be there tomorrow or Saturday. And I haven't had a chance. I hope that